We've got that. So as Graham said, I joined or asked if I could join the salt research group earlier this year, because I had been asked to contribute a paper to a festschrift for Professor Mark Brisbane, who was the lead partner at Bournemouth University in a project funded by the European Commission called ECOSAL-Atlantis, which was looking to join together research tourism for salt making sites in Spain, Portugal, France, and the UK. They needed the UK because otherwise they couldn't access the Atlantic Fund. But the main thrust of the project was on the sunny climate salina processes of using the sun to evaporate seawater. And so practically everything that we had to talk about in the UK was always described as the UK is different. But what we were able to demonstrate to them is that not only were our processes different from the coastal processes in France and Spain and Portugal, but we had lots of different processes within our own region. And as part of the project, which I shall show you a bit later on, we were able to include a kind of gazetteer of salt making sites and museums along the Atlantic coast. And because Cheshire has a short coastline that meets the Irish Sea, the whole of Cheshire was included within that project. And in fact, we did bring people to Nantwich. I'm just waiting, somebody had their microphone on. So if you could all just mute microphones, please, it helps a lot. So we were able to bring some delegates across to actually have a look around Northwich and Middlewich. We saw the very early, Lyne Saltworks then was still boarded up. It hadn't even started being restored. Middlewich brine pump was boarded up, and the town council was looking to start the restoration works. But perhaps at that stage, one of the prime exhibits was the salt ship in Nantwich Museum. And I move on from that. I was able to utilize all of the, over the subsequent years, I've been putting together a kind of trusted sources for salt making and taking all of the documentary accounts and trying to make sense of how those processes were carried out. And so I've been making three-dimensional models using a 3D package to build my own salt works and to see how they all stack together. So a lot more of the work has to involve the surroundings of salt works and where the brine came from, not just the hearths, the furnaces, the salt pans and the evaporation processes. So we'll see some of these models later on during the presentation. This is the final meeting that took place in Alava district, or the Basque region in northern Spain, where they have a salt valley, and we'll see some pictures of that later on as well. So it's Roger Herbert who did all of the biological work to do with animals and plants associated with salt making sites. Myself, Mark Brisbane with the beard in the background on the right, and David Cranston, a well-known industrial archaeologist who's based in Gateshead in the northeast of England. And David and I, once this project was finished, teamed up with Tom Lane from, or recently retired from Heritage Lincolnshire, so that we could use or set up a legacy project, which we call ECOSAL-UK, which is based on some of the concepts of ECOSAL-Atlantis. I'll tell you a bit more about ECOSAL right at the very end. The salt ships, of course, are perhaps they are unique in the UK, and I've not come across any others in Europe either. So this process of brine storage within a saltworks is very unique. But perhaps using a kind of birding analogy or butterfly analogy, they are rare but locally common. So there seem to be a great concentration of these features within Nantwich saltworks, which nobody has yet found in other saltworks across the country. And the first of these was excavated by Bean and McNeill in the 1980s and in First Wood Street, and the second one was raised in 2003-4 in Second Wood Street by Lee Dodd. And despite the whole exercise of lifting these structures complete, sadly, all that is now on display, I say all because they are unique items, are the central section that's left in that's now in the Lion Saltworks from Robina's salt ship, and one of the end sections from Second Wood Street, because though it was lifted whole in Nantwich, by the time it got to the conservation laboratory in York, it had already been sawn into 3 sections. I think that the cutting up of the Second Wood Street one reflected probably the fact that Nantwich Museum could never house an 8-metre long oak tree trunk within its museum display thing set up. But it might be possible at some stage in the future, if the space is available, to join the 3 sections back together so that the full size of the ship can be appreciated in the future. So here again, we've got these enormous structures weighing, what, 1.5 tons. And when I started to do the background research, I got in touch with York, and Steve Allen, who from York, who did these drawings, sadly told me that though the Robina McNeill ship had been treated by what was then the Cheshire Museum Service when they had a conservator with polyethylene glycol. Sadly, it had not been looked after properly within the stores, and he was asked to make a new record of it, and then it was chainsawed up, and only the central section now remains, which I think is quite sad. But we'll come back to these in the kind of middle to the end part of the talk, because what I wanted to concentrate on when I talked to Graham was how the brine actually got from the brine well to the pan house. It was stored within these salt ships so that the brine could be ladled into quite small lead salt pans, and there was a kind of production process of evaporating a given quantity of brine at one firing, because the brine wells themselves weren't capable of giving a 24-hour endless supply of brine without running dry. So you lifted the brine up from the brine well, you delivered it to the pan houses or the salt houses, witch houses, stored it either in the salt ships or in barrels, which we'll also see later, and then you bailed during your firing period from the salt ships until white salt was manufactured. And the other things that we'll come back to relate to contacts that I've made over the years. As many of you know, that I worked for Vale Borough Council on the restoration of the Lion Saltworks, and secured the Heritage Lottery funding, which Cheshire West and Chester used to restore the buildings. And we held a lot of events for publicity at Saltworks. One of them in 2003 included inviting a variety of researchers from across Europe and one from America to come to a conference which we called SALT 2003. And the publication Saltworks and Salinas, which may still be available at the Lion Saltworks shop, was published in 2005. And Katia Herso from Spain came to this conference. Sonia Pinto from Portugal, who'd been taking part in another European project called All About Salt that linked Spain up with Salinas in the Mediterranean. Jens Veloff from Denmark, Juan Lasegabasta from the Salt Valley in Spain, and Suzanne Julich from who was an archaeology student looking at salt making in Germany. So I'd already started to kind of assimilate the similarities and differences in salt making in the UK with salt making overseas. And in 2006, with my wife Annalise, we pulled together a lot of documentary accounts to produce a timeline for salt making from the earliest days right the way up to the closure of the open pan salt industry and the beginning of the modern vacuum industry. And as spin-offs from those works, Suzanne Julich eventually published her thesis in 2008, which we shall see later. And as part of the ECOSAL project, we synthesized a lot of the more recent excavations, and they were included in a book published in French called Sels et Salines, which is salts and salinas of Atlantic Europe. Sadly, that is only available in French, and Suzanne's is only available in German. But I'm going to show you a couple of sections from those, because Suzanne's work is probably the only complete, well, up to the publication date, of salt pans from Cheshire. She looked at salt making the whole of Northwest Europe, and I think she got 24 salt pans or pieces of salt pans from Cheshire, one from Germany and one from France. Across the whole of Europe, we've got the greatest concentration of surviving salt pans in the whole of Western Europe. So we can see here 3 pans from Shavington. I've got something obscuring my screen at the bottom. I think the one on the right is an early one that was excavated from or found in Northwich in the 19th century, and so was at Warrington Museum. And then we've got pans from Nantwich Museum, which is the one on display on the left-hand side, and Middlewich, and a set of 3 pans that were found at Bostock and was donated actually to the Lion Saltworks Trust first, and are now part of the collection within Cheshire West and Chester Museums. They were on display for a long time at the Lion Saltworks. So the 1 or 2 of these salt pans, when they were excavated, because they got inscriptions, were included in archaeological publications in this country. But for a set of colour plates of these, you can still buy online this thesis from the German publishers. And then in the French book that was the outcome of ECOSAL Atlantis, there's a summary of the processes that were undertaken to make salt in the UK. But there's also a gazetteer in which we're able to list sites that the public could go and visit. So on the right-hand side, you've got the Lion Saltworks, Murgatroyd's brine pump, a sign saying Witch House Lane, which sadly they've missed the W off when they printed the picture, and the salt ship that's on display in Nantwich Museum, the Winsford rock salt mine at the bottom, and then on the left-hand side you can see the excavation of the second Wood Street excavations just before it was lifted. And so through ECOSAL and this project, people who are interested in salt making in the UK can certainly find out about museums such as Nantwich, the brine pump at Murgatroyd's, and the Lion Saltworks, and hopefully, you know, those specialist people at some stage may make an attempt to visit them in this country. But for those and for those who perhaps don't know the whole area, I thought it'd be just worthwhile putting in the witch towns of Cheshire, Northwich, Middlewich, and Nantwich, just to locate ourselves, and the smaller sites at higher and lower Fulwich or Dirtwich on the Welsh Shropshire border. Also located on there, the various abbeys, Combermere Abbey, Vale Royal Abbey, and Poulton Abbey that moved to Delacres Abbey in Staffordshire, and Basingworth and St Warburg's, because they had salt interests in Middlewich, Northwich, and Nantwich. And the dates for these abbeys fit in, I think, quite nicely with the construction of, or the fabrication of salt ships. So we go on to a timeline. The sources that we have for salt making in Cheshire as documents begin in Domesday, which would be the subject of a lecture all on its own in its own right. But the transition between that Saxon and Norman salt making process is still something that we need to spend a lot more time trying to work out. And then there's a whole cluster of documents that we'll look at through the rest of this talk, from the middle of the 16th century to the middle of the 17th century, because they describe the salt ships and also these canals in some detail. And then Combermere Abbey and Vale Royal Abbey I've got here as dates because they link in, as we'll see, with the salt ships. Combermere Abbey actually had was gifted land in Nantwich, I think probably about a quarter of it, with witch houses. And salt ships have been seen in the past. There are documentary accounts of them being found on Welsh Row in 1588 and again in 1884, but the excavations didn't take place until 1980, 2003 and 2004. But the first Wood Street excavations date to about 1166 to 1191 by dendrochronology, and the second Wood Street salt ship is 1246 to 1282. So there is a gap between the fabrication of these ships. So it wasn't as if they were all made exactly at the same time for a particular reason. There's perhaps a gap here, could be 100 years between the fabrication of the two, and the third ship at Three Pigeons hasn't been dendro dated. But the dates for, say, first Wood Street show that possibly the artisans who were constructing Combermere Abbey, all of the stonework people, stonemasons, and the timber work that was required for the roofs and so on, there certainly were skilled people that were able to fashion and make structures such as the salt ships within the Cheshire area. And I think that that's something we could look at in greater detail over the coming years. So the documentation that describes these ships is quite numerous. So we've seen, I think, the first one before: the pits be so set about with canals that the salt water is easily derived to every man's house. And at Nantwich, very many canals go over Weaver River for the commodity of deriving the water to the salters' troughs. Branker, school teacher, says that there will be troughs to convey each man's brine from ye common pit, whither he pleases, for his use, and every man knows his own troughs. Leyland says that hath only one salt pit, and they call it the brine pit, which is 14 feet from the river, out of which they convey salt by troughs of wood into houses adjoining. Smith says that from whence they carry the brine to witch houses, saving such houses as stand on the further side of the river. Within the said houses are great barrels set deep into the earth, which are all filled with salt water. This is interesting because within Nantwich, he's saying that there may be two different ways of delivering brine to a witch house. One, the brine is carried and the houses on the further side of the river have their brine delivered in a different way. Wilbraham's diaries describe King James visiting Nantwich to observe the labours of the brine workers, where the brine is lifted up and emptied into troughs, which convey the brine into the house. And Ray, the vessels where it into the brine is by troughs conveyed from the brine pit is called the ship. So we've got the various terminology, the names, and the relationships between the brine pit ships and the brine troughs. And then in 1563, you can read in Paul's Nantwich the ancient salt laws and customs of salt making, where it's lawful for every person and persons being occupiers from time to time to make and amend the theats or the channels or the leats wherein the brine runneth in all such places between the brine pit and the witch house as hath been used and accustomed by ancient time, and that every persons and their briners shall and made lawful at all times have free in-gate and out-gate and passage to and fro the said theats, upon whose grounds soe'er they lie, to follow their brine and to amend and repair the said theats accordingly, without any contradiction of the said owners of such ground, where any such theats do lie. So there's real legal protection for your ability to get brine from the pit to your salt works, even over somebody else's land. So let's look at the three towns separately. So we've got Canals going over the Weaver Valley, over the Weaver River for delivering salt as troughs. And as part of these 3D models, I've been looking at what these might have looked like. At the moment, these are all schematic, but perhaps in time it'd be possible to turn these into proper walkthrough models that would have a lifelike feel to them. So nobody's ever located any of these, but we could perhaps use this on maps to see where they might be and then what kind of features they might leave in the ground, so that if an opportunity arises in the future, we'd actually know how to look for them. And on the other side, or the other method of storing them, that within the said houses are great barrels set deep into the earth, which are filled with salt water. And all of the excavations that have been made at First and Second Wood Street and at the Three Pigeons, barrels were an integral feature of salt houses and would have been storing brine, or even perhaps saving some of the brine, the strengthened brine that's left over at the end, mineral rich, perhaps was stored in separate barrels for use as a kind of chemical source. In Northwich, it seems to be slightly different, where there is a most plentiful and deep brine pit that has stairs made about it by which they draw water out of it in leather buckets, ascend half naked into the troughs and pour it thereinto, by which it's carried into the witch houses. And that these troughs are actually sunk into the ground with boards over the top of them. So here I've got wooden troughs with brine inside it, with boards sat over the top to stop debris going in. The local customs within Northwich, like Nantwich, said that all of these things had to be kept clear of filth and dirt and had to be cleaned regularly. Whereas in Middlewich, the troughs are described as being over men's heads. So if we think about how these troughs were carried over the river Weaver, perhaps these troughs above head height would have had the same kind of support. I've got two different versions in the drawing here. But this would be able to carry at a slight incline, because the brine would have to flow down the troughs to carry the brine over undulating ground, perhaps to where, perhaps over the river valley in Middlewich, to where the salt pans were on the edge of town. So we've got three different types, ways of delivering brine from a brine pit to a salt house, where it's then put into perhaps a salt ship or a barrel, each doing the same process, but manufactured in a slightly different way. But Calvert says that the last salt in Nantwich was made in 1856 in a pit which is on Snow Hill behind the town hall, which is where the present Viat is, and it was conveyed in wooden troughs under the road to the premises of Mr. Bowker, now where his premises now stand, where one of the sheds which covered the salt pans, 3 in number, may still be seen. And it would be interesting to see whether or not under the road and perhaps under where the town hall used to stand, whether or not that channel still survives. So I started to look at where else timber tree trunks had been hollowed out to make water channels. And this is a drawing, funnily enough, made by Steve Allen, the same timber specialist in York who drew the ships from Nantwich. And this is an excavation at Bawdsley Abbey in Redditch, Worcestershire. And this structure dates to 1170 as part of Bawdsley Abbey. And it's actually a drain for the mill pond. The device on the right-hand side has a lever to enable you to virtually lift a plug out so that from a pipe in the bottom of the mill pond, water could run down this channel and you'd be able to drain your mill pond and do any repairs to it. And the photographs of this are on the right-hand side. Might be something that we should be looking for in Nantwich as a theat or a canal. On the bottom of the photograph, you can see the dugouts channel from an oak tree, and the top one shows it with a board on the top of it because perhaps, to keep all the debris out of it. And that would be what they've described as the brine channels in Northwich. So these were constructed by people who built all of the mills and leats around Bawdsley Abbey. Why couldn't the same types of carpenters associated with Combermere Abbey and Vale Royal Abbey brought their skills to our area to make these channels for the saltworks? And going back to the ECOSAL-Atlantis connection, on the left-hand side there is a canal channel used for carrying brine down the salt valley in the salt valley of Anyana. The saltworks are scattered around the sides of a valley, but the brine springs are at the top of the valley. So they tapped into these springs and carried the brine waters down and then delivered it into the different evaporating system, which was operated in the same way as a salina overseas. You can see how the timber trunks are joined together in the right-hand slide. And on the left-hand side, a very simple way of enabling the brine to bifurcate from a central canal with an end stop to stop a flush of brine water from spilling out over the side. So it actually enables it to be taken off to the left and right of the main distribution channel. And Katia Herso from Madrid, who runs an organization called Friends of Inland Salinas, kindly sent me some more slides of how these channels look in different parts of Spain. I haven't actually been able to link up the actual locations for you, but I'm sure I can if anybody asks. You can see simple, perhaps pine tree cut hollowed out logs on the left-hand side. In the middle, the channel is carried over a valley, perhaps in the same way that was described in Middlewich. On the bottom side, a circular gin building with a pony or a horse is used to lift the brine up from underground and feed the brine into the channel, the distribution into the evaporation pans on either side. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see one of these channels being held on very simple wooden posts. There's no supports on either side of it, just very rough and made up. But notice in the summer how any brine that's soaking through the wood or is spilling over the site crystallizes out. And it'd be interesting to know whether or not we could find in any diaries anybody describing any channels in Nantwich which might have been encrusted with this white salt crystal, because it would have been quite noticeable during some periods. And we heard earlier that there was a difference between carrying brine from a brine well to a salt house rather than delivering it to a trough. And Agricola in his woodcuts shows exactly that, of people with large barrels slung on poles carrying brine from the brine well to the salt houses. And on the right-hand side, we can see an extract from a festival that takes place each year in Salis de Bayern in southwest France, just inland of Biarritz, where there is a salt museum, and the salt houses there have channels underneath the floor so that the brine is tipped into a collecting channel outside the house, and it's fed into an underground storage tank inside or under the floor of the house, where the salt pans are set up with a chimney, a hood over the top to catch the evaporation steam from the salt pans, and the salt that is harvested from these pans is placed onto a cotton or calico material for it to dry out and be heated from the steam passing underneath the smoke hood. And the Salt Festival involves a series of races whereby different teams carry these enormous barrels of brine, and that there is a prize given to the people who do the route the fastest, but they also have to have their brine measured at the end of the run. And not only do they have to be the fastest, but they also have to have the most amount of brine remaining in their bucket to win the competition. We also don't have in Cheshire any brine wells or pumps that we've found. And this is an excavation done in Northwich, published by Derek Hurst. All of the publications that I've shown you this evening are actually all available to download online if you look them all up. And this is my 3D model of what that shaft and brine well would have looked like. And that's set within a town square with all of the salt houses scattered around, grouped around it. It's very similar in appearance to the 16th century maps of Northwich and Nantwich. There are not many brine pumps surviving either, but this one was excavated in a pump shaft at the salt works that survives at Port Eynon on the Gower Peninsula. It's kind of west of Swansea. But there's a seawater tank that has a brine pipe feeding seawater in at high tide into that rectangular channel. And in the corner, the top corner of the channel, there's a wooden chamber in which this brine pump on the right-hand side was actually excavated in situ. And in Scotland, for collecting seawater, rather than some of the descriptions describe people going down to the coast to a bucket pot with a bucket and collecting their seawater, but a big painting drawn by a Dutch artist in 1720 shows the harbour at Weems Castle, and the coloured one on the top, you can see the steam evaporating from the salt pans, and projecting out into the sea, there's a series of structures on stilts. These have bucket and wands positioned on the top of them to enable people to lift seawater out of a bucket or out of the sea itself and put it into a channel in order to allow that to be fed into the salt. And there's another painting on the bottom right-hand corner on the other side of the Firth of Forth to the Joppa salt pans in Portobello that has a similar structure on the left-hand side that may actually be showing an Archimedes screw being used to lift the seawater up to feed it into the salt pans. And archaeologically, the Scape Archaeological Trust have looked at the structures that show in the rock below the positions of these salt houses. There are kind of recesses cut into the rock face, the rock itself, for the legs of these structures to be bedded properly into the seabed. Just down the coast from where I am now at Cross Canonby, on the Solway coast, there was a salt works for the 1630s, and a lease of 1649 describes the fact that there were 2 salt pans, water sumps, swath, and all singular other appurtenances belonging to it. An initial interpretation showed a feature on the beach as perhaps being a tower that fed brine into the salt pan. But erosion of the beach has shown that there are brine pipes set within the sand. And this much here of sand has been eroded since the middle of the 17th century. And within that sand, there was a set of pipes that enabled water at high tide to enter the pipe, and water finding its own level would actually have filled up a brine well, a brine shaft or tank within the salt works itself. So even though perhaps the sea was at this stage about 200 or 300 meters offshore, they were still bringing the seawater into the salt works, well away from where they might have been, might have suffered from coastal erosion. And that's similar to a different salt making process in Lincolnshire, where a brine pipe, again, not a trough, but a pipe, brought water in under the coastal sandy sand dune areas to where the sleeching process of washing salt out of sand was carried out. And Brownrigg describes this as where they make a little pond in the rocks or stones in the sand, which they call their sump. And from this pond, they lay a pipe through which, when the tide is in, the seawater runs into a well adjoining the salt making process. So again, you're taking seawater from some way away and bringing it to your salt works to actually begin the evaporation process. And at St. Monans in Fife, there's a series of rock cut and brick lined tanks out towards the sea, and a rank of 9 pan houses set up inland, where the seawater is fed from those tanks to in a sluice, and is actually pumped by the windmill into a header tank, which is then fed into each of the 9 pan houses. And in 17th century, Robert Hooke, writing for the Royal Society, described the process of feeding strengthened brine from a partial solar process of strengthening brine, whereby the strengthened brine was fed into a cistern and then was pumped by hand through the device labelled H in his diagram to a header tank labelled I. And then there was a pipe feeding out of the header tank that went back down under the floor, fed back up into the salt pan labelled M, so that you use the pump to raise the brine into the header tank, and then opened a tap and it flew by gravity into the salt pan. And that's almost identical to the way in which the brine is delivered at the Lion Salt Works via the steam engine to the big Lion Salt Works brine tank up by the canal, which is set higher than salt pans. And then the pipes feed underground, and you can feed the brine in by opening the valve at the head of the pan. So that process hasn't changed from the 1670s until when the Lion Salt Works closed in the 1980s. So we just quickly come to the excavations with it in Nantwich. So we've got Robina McNeil's excavations in the 1980s, Lee Dodd's in Wood Street, and at the Three Pigeons, the red, the green, and the yellow sites. And at each of those, we've got salt chips. And then we've got the sky blue star, which is the one that was seen in 1588, and the light brown one in 1893, either side of Welsh Row. The question is, how many of these salt walling lands have got salt chips in them? Because at the moment, I think we're going for 100% of all the ones that have excavated have got salt chips in them. But we know that not all of these walling clans were actually operational in the 17th century. But it would be interesting to go back through all these title deeds to see whether or not we can see a direct link from the earliest ones that were perhaps set out when they were owned by Combermere Abbey compared to the 17th century. Robina McNeil's was fortunate in being laid out so that she actually could have a complete pan house within her excavation, something Lee Dodd didn't have. And again, I've been putting together these models so I can look at how each of the features are constructed and how it's laid out. Robina at least also tried to reconstruct what a pan house might have looked like, something that many other excavators aren't able to do. And I've joined her two drawings together here to show how they would have been situated close to each other. And then we can set up a fly around diagram to look at the structures, the entrance ways, which have got a baffled entrance, the difference between the wattle walls and the ones that are supported with larger posts, the arrangements of two sets of three pans either side of the timber salt chips. And then you can strip away and alter each of the features by turning off the layers in which those have been drawn. We can see the underground barrels that were laid out for storage of brine or waste deposits or whatever, until we come back to the actual excavation report itself. This is just a kind of starter schematic, but something that we can work on over time. I'm also looking at the artifacts and reproducing those in 3 dimensions as well, so we can populate salt houses with all of the necessary equipment. And this is the starter model for 2nd Wood Street, excavation drawing on the left, and the 3D reconstruction right. Again, the salt chips with the barrels alongside them, and the oval perhaps area where the hearth is, perhaps in the middle of the panels. And we could start looking at what these things were laid out. On the left-hand side, I've got the salt chip with its timber supports, battens over the top, possibly used to support a cover that we can see in the top left-hand diagram. And then the 3 pigeons. It's much smaller. But again, these become keyhole excavations. And as work is development goes on within this quarter of the town, I think somebody's got to bite the bullet and say, are we going to be happy with just keyhole excavations where we look at a little bit of a salt works? Or perhaps is there a much larger research project needs to go on so we can understand the salt houses and the relationship to the distribution of brine through the channels in a more constructive way. So this is distribution of all the plots, the number of leads, and I'm building an interactive database for all of these. This is the layout and distribution of the walling lands that have 6 leads associated with them in yellow, 12 leads in pink, 18 leads in red, and 24 leads in purple. And each of those are identified to individual owners. Thomas Branker, that many of you know, wrote this pamphlet, Considerations of the Salt Works in Nantwich. These are the plots in 1624 that were associated with Macclesfield School. And the plot at the top left-hand corner there that was owned by the school, interestingly, had a school built on top of it, and that is now the Auto Repair Centre. It's just looking at 3 areas. But if any of these plots perhaps no longer function as auto repair centres and come up for sale, demolition notices going in, it would be really important to actually have all of the heritage facts to hand to be able to inform any investigations that need to be done on sites such as this. And Dr. Jackson, looking at his inquiries for the Royal Society of Ways of Salt Making in Nantwich, his process is almost the same, 4 pan houses. He says that there's a salt ship from which the brine is set out, but this is completely different structure to the ones that were excavated by Lee Dodd and Robina McNeill. This is much more kind of industrial rather than organic, as I see it. But again, we don't have any of features such as this that have been uncovered through excavations. So one of my questions is, why do we still use Agricola's woodcuts? It becomes the go-to illustration for 16th century salt making. And as we've seen, there are many, many different salt houses, salt ways in which these structures were constructed and how brine was put together. Within Nantwich, the really good reconstruction was done after the excavation of the second Wood Street excavation, which goes a long way towards perhaps being a bit more realistic about what a salt house or witch house at this period might have looked like. And finally, William Brereton, Civil War to do with Cheshire. He went on his travels in 1635 and visited South Shields, where he describes a salt house, which is like the one that his brother Booth had at Dunham. But he then goes to describe this set, 6 rank of pans in 4 in a rank, 12 furnaces, 12 fires erected in this manner, placed 2 and 2 together, one against the other, 6 pans in the highest rank, and the bottom equal in the lower rank. Just get this one to spin round. I mean, this is completely alien to anything that was constructed in Nantwich at the same period. This is taking seawater and it's double or triple boiling the brine in the top pan, feeding it into the second pan where the waste heat that's evaporated brine 2 or 3 times in the top pan is then evaporated at a cooler temperature in order to have the salt harvested out of it. So it's optimizing the fuel that's used to evaporate seawater, which of course is not as strong as brine that we have in Cheshire. And of course, it helps explain why salt making, perhaps in Nantwich, other than its transport links, which were inferior eventually to Northwich and Middlewich, why the salt making process in Nantwich eventually died out. It just couldn't compete with this scale of industrialization and the cheap transport that could be offered from Northwich. And on that final slide of moving into the industrial period, just quickly, just to explain that ECOSAL-UK issues an online newsletter. You can find it, download it from our website. We had our 10th issue at the end of last year. And there's also a Google map, which links into a whole variety of other salt-related things, not just salt making, but salt-based pottery, ships that have sunk carrying salt, people that are buried in churches are sorted with salt making. And on that note, I will stop my sharing and